audio world. A lot of videos of Mike Wells talking, and he's great.
Yeah, Matt Boudreau from Working Class Audio was talking about him after he passed away.
Yeah, Mike Wells, great guy, huge loss.
Yeah.
So he was the one who explained the speaker concept to me. And I hadn't really thought about the physical medium of the playback system up until Mike really talked to me about it. He's also the one that taught me about tonal, he called them bumps, but tonal bumps from circuits. Because I hadn't really spent that much time thinking about why we like tubes and transformers and what they add. So like there were times where he would say, man, sometimes I just run your audio through different pieces of gear to get the bump, such as an API 5500 EQ. And he wouldn't even do anything with it. I'd be like, dude, why did you just instantiate that API? And he would look at me and he goes, for the bump of the 2520 op amps. 2520? 2550? Anyways, the op amps, the classic op amp bump. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And he goes, come here. And I would sit down in his chair and he would just hard bypass that EQ with nothing on it. And then until you could zone in, and on his system in that room, it was so dialed in on those giant ATCs that I finally could hear the signal just as a signal. And I was like, oh, now I know what I'm listening for, how it would saturate certain bands, how it would do whatever. Now you have to learn them all, but once you can hear it, it changes your perspective on gear. And so that's harmonics. And it goes back to our little mini conversation on saturation. I think it's better to reach for a device to do the compression or EQ job that also does the other job of adding the tone that you're needing, if that makes sense. Because you can get a twofer. Yeah,
it's so cool. I spoke recently with a mixer out of the Netherlands named Nina, and she was telling me that to get like when she gets like a vocal that's like, you know, the Focusrite sound that people talk about, you know, recorded on a cheap, you know, USB interface, to kind of get like good harmonics reinfused, she sends like the signal to like a Pultec EQ, like an analog Pultec EQ, and it infuses it with, and she'll just like dial in like 10 dB top and bottom or something, and it just infuses it with all this good harmonic saturation to kind of compensate for all the shit that was there before. I was like,
well, that wasn't there before. Well, okay, so but that's the circuit, right? So what she's doing is she's if it's just a mic pre and a mic and it doesn't have any chance to add harmonics along the way. I mean, you got to know, like really these top level productions, they're so bright. Like everything is so bright. It's crazy how bright records are, and you don't really realize it because it's not equalizing that's spiked. You know what I mean? There isn't like the comical Chris Lord-Alge memes about like just taking 10K and just boost it through the roof. That's not what's happening. Right. Like, and he's an artist with it. So like he knows when to do and when not to do this stuff, but things really are bright. Like it's surprising how bright stuff is. I remember this, if you look at like the Tool records, like the early Tool records, they're not that bright and it has a different sound to it. But if you compare it to modern pop records, there's so much top end, but it's so beautiful and crisp and it's not painful. And that kind of comes back to the dynamic EQing thing we were talking about earlier. You've really got to know how to handle the mid-range. Like the key to all mixing is in two places, the low end and the high mid-range, right? Between 2K and 6K. How you handle 2K to 6K tells me how good of a mixer you are, because bass is a thing that's so dependent on the room you're mixing in. You know, you can either hear it or you can't. And it's okay if you can't, because that's what a mastering engineer will help you with. But how you treat the mid-range, how you treat 2K to 6K is really the defining factor of a great mixer, because you can't take away too much either, because some people won't sound like themselves. So you have to ride the line, and you do want some things to kind of have some bite to them. And if you take too much out and don't put enough back in, it's a delicate balance, you know? And so for that point, I really recommend Isotope Tonal Balance Control 2. I love that meter, and I always keep it up in my sessions, and I look over at it and I check things, especially when I'm, reaching the almost done stage. I really do reference tonal balance control, and I want to see where I'm looking. And more often than not, when I look, I'm usually pretty good, but then I'll see a little pocket and I'll just blindly say, okay, I know what I got sounds pretty good, but what if I just try and fill that pocket that I'm seeing, and I'll listen and I will improve my own records. Now you have to be, again, artful about that, because you don't want to do something just because you see it on a meter, all on mixing with your eyes.
You don't want to like pink noise mix or whatever people do.
But I'm also not a kid anymore, and my hearing has deteriorated a little bit. So treating some of these things, trusting them, the good tools, is not a bad thing. And always reference. I always reference. Like somebody asked me the other day, when you're mastering for a client, how loud do you typically make it, like numbers wise? And I said, I have no idea because I don't look at the numbers. I reference against the Tidal masters without the algorithm playlists. And I want to hear how loud everybody else is mastering and get in that genre. And I hit 4 or 5 of the songs in the playlist, and there's a small range, 4 or 5 dB range, but you pick the good ones. And then the goal is always to get right there. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect because that's what the algorithm will fix. But if you don't listen to those playlists and you don't compare apples to apples with a gain stage signal, then you don't know what target you're shooting for. So eventually what happened is, after a few years in this room, I was shooting that same target so often, I bought the TC Electronics stereo meter, that little, I don't know if you can see it you probably can't. It's on that side of the, what is it called? It's called the.
But I think I've seen those in a lot of people's studios.
It has the radar function. So there's the circular thing, and then there's a little radar that turns like a clock needles. And then there's a line, and then you can set that line to loudness target, and then it fills up in time, and it kind of paints in a different color, and it shows you your loudness. So what I do is I've adjusted that line to based on what my target is, and then now I take the final peak limiter and I push it until my audio hits the line, and then I go back and reference against the playlists, and I'm usually within a dB or 2. So you do have to have good tools, and that's a big part about calibrating your studio and really getting in a good rut. You want the repetitions, like you said earlier. It's all about repetitions because you refine your process. And what feels like a rut or feels like you're having a Groundhog's Day moment where you're doing the same thing every day is really the refinement of a process. And on an artistic level, as you strip away the confusion and the variables, it allows the organic art to spring up in its place. And that's really where you have the freedom of expression, because none of the obstacles are in the way as you continue to refine your process. You're not thinking about what you do next. You do the same thing every time. But now what makes it special, songwriting, lead vocals, melody, guitar parts, whatever, right? That's what makes it special, not the 10K. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, in terms of like going back to that moment at Mixed with the Masters with Jack Joseph Puig, was there something did you learn like a big lesson in terms of like, I don't know, it sounds like you needed to figure out how to get your balances, and like I feel like the magic of the mix sometimes is really that right balance of like, there's not, like you seem to have that pretty dialed in. Was that one of the big things that you took away from that?
It was a huge thing. I'm 20 something plus years into it now. So I do things my way, and I've kind of grown to be able to do it again with the repetitions. I don't have to really think about it anymore. It's not, but there was years where I only thought about it, and I replayed. I've got my diary from there. They give you a little black notebook, and I've got copious notes. And I would go back and reread that diary multiple times. And when I was finishing a mix, I would go back into that and be like, all right, what did he say about this? So to answer your question, I've talked about this on Pro Studio Live. I've talked about this on the Recording Studios podcast, Rockstars podcast with Liz, who I love. It's the rule of 3. This is a bit of a controversial topic, but I've said this before, and this is kind of how JJP and I conversed about it. How he explained it to me was how do pickpockets work. They overwhelm your senses, and so you don't notice them stealing your wallet. How do they do that? They touch you, they bump into you, they talk to you, they make eye contact. So they're overwhelming all of your senses at the same time, and they're doing multiple forms of physical contact. So they'll literally bump you with a shoulder, touch you with 2 hands, pat you a few times, and then while they're patting you on the arm, one hand slips in your jacket, steals your wallet, and they're out, and it's fast. And that concept also exists in audio because our brain triangulates data the same way that our eyes do, right? Stereoscopic. Yeah. And that's the essence of LCR. It's phantom center. Yeah. And so I believe in this thing that I call the 3 columns of audio. So if you like artful science, you're familiar with the golden ratio.
Yeah.
And the golden ratio also appears in how we deal with mid-side processing. So a mid-side compressor has a little mid-side matrix. It reverses the phase on one side and subtracts it and adds it, and you can look all that up. But the point is that what it does is it splits your audio into 3 columns, really 2 columns, but it really is 3 columns. So up the center, somewhere around 42 left and 42 right in Pro Tools, depending on the pan law you've chosen, you have a column of audio that is, quote, quote, the center. And as you pan things to the left or the right of dead center, they still feel like they're coming out of the center. And were you to put them in a mid-side compressor, you'd be compressing them in the mid part, not the side part. I mean, there's always a little bit because it's off center, but you know what I'm saying. So mid-side mixing is really powerful because you have to think about these 3 columns of audio, because this is effectively what's going to be the final thing that happens in your chain. If you got a top grade mastering engineer, they're going to work in mid-side on purpose. And the reason is, if I can compress the mids, what am I doing? I'm compressing the kick, the snare, the lead vocal, and the bass, and the guitar solos, or whatever else lives in the mid, to squish that down and optimize the canvas and my use of the canvas so that I don't have strange overages that pop up every now and again, sometimes not always. And once I've done that, I have the opportunity to gain up the center channel afterwards. Same thing for the sides. The sides being hard left and right, hard 100 left to 43 left, then nothing, and then 43 right to 100 right is technically the sides. So if you wanted to make the left side and the right side consistent, you would need a dual mono compressor way before on a subgroup that was compressing left and right to make sure that they were even and neither one of them had too much versus the other. Not a stereo compressor, because a stereo compressor would turn the fader down on everything going through the bus, evenly through the EQ spectrum and through the pan sphere.
Right.
But a dual mono compressor sits on top of the hard left and right like a boat in the ocean, and it goes back and forth independently and says, oh, you're too tall, squeeze down. The other side, oh, you're too tall, squeeze down. The sticky outies get pushy downy. So treating that and understanding that you're mixing in these kind of dimensions, you have a group. So when you talk about subgroups, one way to approach mixing, the way that I tend to approach mixing, is I have my all music group except bass and drums. And then this is a dual mono compressor. Oftentimes it's the Shadow Hills. And I'm doing dual mono because I want to regulate left to right evenness. And then I'll have the exact same setup with the same harmonics, same whatever, same plugin, but instead the next subgroup will be the stereo compression. So guitar solos, any lead part that I don't want to get squishy by the hard left and right guys, you could even, if you wanted, have like a left 80, right 80 bus, right? So anything that's hard left and right, 100 would get one dual mono bus. You could have a secondary bus that was left 80 and left right, right? So you could feather out and stack your mix if you wanted to. That's interesting. Or you would do like a mid-side compressor, but we're going to save that for your master bus, not the subgroups. And then the lead instrument solos and such, right? So you want to regulate between different instruments. So you've got a stereo compressor volume down evenly on anything that goes through it. And that's one way to make sure nothing is louder than anything else. And then what's great is if you're hitting that compressor, you can push up into it and the compressor will tell you when you've hit it by tickling the needle. And then you have a good option for like, okay, that's pretty darn close, right? And then you may listen in mono and check it a few times and make sure. But that's another great way to make sure, like, if people are trading solos, that you've got a good fast way to get to an even dynamic between different instruments. So you wouldn't want things in that bus that would tank the bus and cause pumping that you didn't want. So for that reason, a long time ago, I discovered that I didn't like master bus compression. And I made a big stink about it. And I was like, no, that's not the way. Subgroups are the way, a la Michael Brower. And what I realized is that I was right and I was wrong, as in all the way all things go. I was right because if you have a stereo compressor that compresses the entire source like a volume fader, linked stereo compression, then if the lead vocal gets big, the music bed will get quiet because the job of a compressor is to hold it in place. Not necessarily over compression will make it get quieter, but a compressor says, ooh, you stay right there. You hit the threshold, so let's keep you there. And then if the vocal's loudest and the vocal hits the threshold because it's